Yo, what's up? This is Jay Dennis, and we're back with another Ranked and Reviewed. First one of the new year, 2021. And today we are doing maybe one of my, I guess we'll say definitely one of my favorite metal bands. In terms of favorite overall bands, probably in my top 20. Fucking Slayer, man! Sorry for all the volume swells. Anyway, yeah. We are doing Slayer today, a band that I have been into since I was 14. They were introduced to me the same time that I got into the other big four bands. Same guy, my friend Damon. He burned me some CDs, got me into the big four. He got me into them quicker than my dad could, but eventually, my dad got me into the, Metallica more so also. But at any rate, yeah, I've been listening to Slayer, not on again, off again since I was 14, but I listened to them a lot my freshman year of high school. And then, the summer of 2019, along with Seven Dust Summer, I had listened to the entire Slayer discography. But since then, I really haven't listened to them a whole lot. But I was like, I really like this band. They got a solid discography. They got a solid legacy. I want to go and rank and review it. So be sure to check out my other ranked and reviewed ones. It's probably been a few weeks since I put out my last couple of Black Dahlia Murder or System of a Down or Seven Dust. So thank you for all the love that those are getting. Subscribe to the channel. Make sure you check out the rest of them. I'm doing a lot of metal music, but I'll occasionally sprinkle in some interesting bands or interesting pop acts like Taylor Swift or who else? Eminem. That's not pop, that's rap. But maybe doing Ariana Grande here soon. But at any rate, let's stick to the fucking heavy-ass music. So, interesting thing about Slayer is, at least in my opinion and in my analysis, I may or may not be breaking a whole lot of ground here with some of this analysis, but I do believe that some of my rankings and some of my insights on some of the albums might be unique to me. Let me know in the comments what you agree and disagree with, or how maybe you would rank them differently, or what songs resonate with you so much. Tom Arroyo, the front man of the band, he's the vocalist and the bass player. It's pretty cool when the bassist is the singer. Kind of frees up the other two guitar players to be more vicious. Not that James Hetfield or Dave Mustaine weren't vicious on the guitar, but kind of frees up Jeff Hanneman and Kerry King, and then I forget his name. He was from Exodus, I believe. He played on Repentless, but it just frees up the guitar players to just kind of go a little bit more crazy. And with regards to the big four, Slayer is definitely the most evil sounding. They are definitely the most extreme metal out of the four. And in my opinion, Tom Arroyo is the best vocalist. I love James Hetfield. Dave Mustaine really grew on me. The vocalist of Anthrax, the main one. I know they had a different one in the 90s, but the main guy, he's got a fucking classic 80s voice, and he sounds awesome. But there's just something menacing and, of course, evil, and then, of course, that banshee howl that he does. When he gets more aggressive with complementary lower-tuned guitars, especially in the 2000s, Tom Arroyo just fucking dominates. His voice is my favorite, and Dave Lombardo is he's up there at the top. He's hanging with Nick Menza of Megadeth, and then sorry, there's not a whole lot that I know about Anthrax, but I'm just talking about the big four in general. But basically, what I'm trying to say is Slayer is beyond comfortable sitting up there in the big four, and there are aspects of them that are the best of the big four. The lead guitar work is a little different. The guitar riffing in general is a little different, but there's a charm to it. So, got a lot of good things to say about Jeff Hanneman's, rest in peace, his lead playing, Kerry King's riffing, even some of Kerry King's sloppy soloing. There's still a charm to it. So, anyway, wanted to mention all that I do hold Slayer in high regard. I'm kind of putting the satanic or religious themes aside for this, and I'm just mostly looking at it objectively through a musical lens. I'm not here to talk about the the controversy of their lyrics or their themes or their fucking fans. I'm not really gonna touch on that. I'm here to talk about the music and the albums, and I believe that's it. So thank you guys for, listening to me kind of intro these videos before I actually get into the ranking. I put in the timestamps usually or in the description where all the rankings are if you just want to get straight to business. But if you do want to hear context, that's what I do as well. So Slayer is definitely a mainstay for me. Really glad I got back into them. So without further ado, we're going to do their 11 albums, their 11 main studio albums. I'm not going to be doing their punk cover album that they did in the mid-90s. I'm not going to be doing their second technical EP album, like the Haunting Chapel, whatever that's called, the era between Show No Mercy and Hell Awaits. I'm not doing those. Those are just kind of like EPs and combined. So I'm just doing their main studio albums here. We're doing 11, going from 1983 up until their most recent release in 2016. So, buckle up. At the number 11 spot, we have their 1994 release, Divine Intervention, which is their sixth album. The spread between the bottom album and the top album is roughly an even 8 out of 10. So once again, this is a band that I like all their albums, but we are going to see a bit of a spread between the bottom and the top, especially the tippy top. Divine Intervention gets a solid 8 out of 10. It's definitely their least catchy album. It doesn't have a whole lot of hooks. It's got probably their lowest in terms of notoriety, least popular singles. And beyond that, negatives aside, I would say it's a pretty musically solid album. I like the tone of it. I like that it oddly sounds a little bit crunchier, but like the bass end of it sounds more round. So they kind of upgraded their sound a little bit on this album and kind of doubled down on the crunchy tones for some of the guitar work and like the intro to Ditto Head and stuff like that. But basically the only songs that really stuck out for me were the singles, Ditto Head. The best song on the album is Serenity and Murder. There's a great music video for that. I love it. I love that a lot of these tracks are particularly short, make them digestible. And then the last track, Mind Control, is a pretty good closing track. But beyond that, 213, SS3, the title track, Divine Intervention, and then the opening track, Killing Fields. Killing Fields is the worst opening track to a Slayer album. So this is really one of the few albums that got a handful of tracks that dip below 8 out of 10. Slayer has a pretty solid, consistent discography where most of their songs are above an 8 out of 10 for me, but this one was littered with some 7 songs, which means they're still good and they're listenable. They're just not particularly great. Another point I'll mention is that the song Fictional Reality, track 3, does have a pretty solid bridge. I love like the low-end tapping that leads to a really good bridge and a really good like dual guitar solo. So Divine Intervention isn't particularly easy or fun to listen to from start to finish, but if you take out maybe 5 of the 10 tracks, maybe even 6 of the 10 tracks, they're great. They're just not among Slayer's best tracks. And at the end of this video, I'm going to mention what are probably my top 10 Slayer songs. None of them are from Divine Intervention. So at the number 11 spot, Divine Intervention, 8 out of 10. No nostalgia value, but it's worth giving a listen. It's probably a very underrated, under-listened to album. Give it a shot. Maybe you'll have a different opinion from me. At the number 10 spot, we have the follow-up album to that, 1998's Diabolus Musica, which I believe stands for The Devil in Music. This is a very underrated and misunderstood album, and it is not a nu metal album. So just because Slayer flirted with nu metal and some of the themes in the late 90s and then in 2001, it doesn't mean that they went full-blown experimental in any of their albums. Unlike Metallica or Megadeth or maybe even Anthrax, but mostly the bands I know more about. Unlike Metallica and Anthrax, or Metallica and Megadeth, Slayer didn't really stray at all away from their core sound. Diabolus Musica is a very heavy album. It is more rhythmically based and some of the riffing is slower, but there are still some fast-ass tracks on here. Like Bitter Peace, the opening track is fast. Point, the closing track, is fast. I think Scrum is too. But Diabolus Musica is basically just a better version of Divine Intervention, where out of the 11-ish tracks, about half of the album, at least half of the album, there's some solid tracks on here. Bitter Peace is a great song. Stain of Mine is a great single. Point is a great closing track. And then you got some speed going on at the end with like Scrum and Screaming to the Sky, whatever that song is called. You know, it's kind of a sandwich effect where like the first couple tracks are great and the last couple tracks are great, but then aside from Name of God and Love to Hate, I love the song Love to Hate, by the way. I think that's pretty catchy nu metal sounding track. Again, flirting with nu metal, not going full blown, you know, Sepultura or Limp Bizkit here. Sorry. Diabolus Musica is definitely a underrated and misunderstood album, and it's fun to shit on it, but it's actually a pretty solid Slayer album, which is why I didn't just pick the low-hanging fruit and put it at the bottom. I would have loved to have ranked this album higher, but Slayer just put out better albums. And sometimes, just because a band flirts with my favorite genre of nu metal doesn't mean that it's going to be their best album. But stick around throughout the entire video, because you may find that another album where they, again, danced around the edges of that trend of nu metal and during the turn of the century, you may be surprised where I rank another album. So once again, Diabolus Musica, it's not an album that I'd listen to from start to finish that much, but I would take a handful of tracks, like the first three, the last three, Name of God, Love to Hate. Every other track I can kind of take it or leave it, but it's not a bad album. It's not a trash album. I disagree with that sentiment, and that's why it sits comfortably at like an 8.17 out of 10, meaning it wasn't close to Divine Intervention. So, number 10 spot, 1998's Diabolus Musica. Alright, and at the number 9 spot, I'm probably going to catch some flack for this, but I can explain. Just stick around for the whole video, okay? Number 9 spot, we have their sophomore release, 1985's Hell Awaits. It's a 7-track album, and it's actually very solid. The average of it was like an 8.27 out of 10, which means it's a great album. Every song kind of averaged around like an 8.2 out of 10. There were no songs that dipped below that number. At Dawn They Strike, whatever that track's called, track 3, and then Praise of Death, track 4. Those are my favorite tracks off the album, but then Necrophiliac, or however you say it, that's also a really solid track. So the very middle of the album is kind of where like all the best stuff is, but it does still open and close on a solid note. But Hell Awaits is an album that I don't know a whole lot about. I've listened to it from front to back a couple of times, so I'm able to give some sort of insight here. But I can respect it musically as an album, but one of the things I love the most about Slayer is, unlike other big thrash metal bands of the 80s, they don't write long-ass songs. They write short, digestible tracks. Some bands do that well. Some songs are great if you're in the mood, but personally as a metalhead, I have to be in a mood to listen to one of the greatest metal albums of all time, like Master of Puppets or Injustice for All with their long-ass songs, because I generally like shorter, more digestible tracks. I love Dream Theater, but I don't want to listen to 12-minute songs all the time. So Hell Awaits has that issue where this is, even though it's only a 7-song album, most of the songs are like 5 to 6 minutes long. So for me, that's a little bit long. Other albums have shorter, more digestible songs, and it kind of makes the theme or like the flow of the album better, in my opinion. So Hell Awaits is still a solid album. What they accomplished here was a success, but just had a personal preference with some of the tracks being a little long. Even though they're enjoyable and on paper they did it well, it's just typically not my favorite. But we're about to kind of get to some kind of like 3-way ties between some of these albums. The spread's not super big. It's just little tiny margins that make some of these next albums more enjoyable than others. So understand that just because Hell Awaits is at the number 9 spot doesn't mean I don't like it. I really do like the album. So that's that. Next up, we have a 3-way tie, but I've figured out how to rank these based on margins. So consider ranking 8, 7, and 6 albums almost tied, but I did break the tie with either nostalgia value or certain songs that elevate it, or just kind of like the overall theme of the album or the flow. At the number 8 spot, we have their 2009 release, World Painted Blood. once again, a solid album from front to back. I got an 8.31 out of 10. It opens up with probably one of the best songs on the album. World Painted Blood is a solid title track. It's got great melody. It's got great thrash. Oddly, my favorite track on the album is probably something a lot of people will disagree with, because they did something different here. But I like it. I like the song Playing with Dolls. I like that they did something different here. I think it was very well executed. And I like that it kind of still has an evil metal sound, but it's got a little bit of like an alternative sound to it too. So obviously I'm a sucker for new metal, and I'm a sucker for like alternative sounds as well. So Slayer, when they do dabble a bit, they do it well. It kind of adds a little bit of fun and non-repetition to their otherwise solid discography. Excuse me while I sip on coffee. So once again, World Painted Blood, not one of the albums that I'm going to always go to right away and listen to from start to finish, but I have listened to it from front to back a few times, and it is solid. No tracks dip below an 8 out of 10, but really no tracks go above like an 8.6. So that's when we start to see more or less more of my favorite tracks from Slayer once we get to some of these higher ranked albums. The thrashiness, the heaviness was definitely existent in World Painted Blood. It's a solid Slayer album. To me, it's a more successful version of Divine Intervention, where it's kind of an album that's under the radar, but they did better with putting more hooks and more vintage and simultaneously more modernly well executed Slayer sounds on this album. But sonically and just in general, it sits comfortably at the 8th spot, because while it's a solid album, it's not their best by any means. It's worth a shot, though. Every Slayer album is worth a shot. Next up, we're going back in time at the number 7 spot. Probably going to get some flack for this one, too. But I really like this album. It's their first release, Show No Mercy. The reason why I say I might get some flack is because I actually look at quite a few other people's videos and ranks, or like blogs where people do this, too. Just for reference, I want to see what other people think too. It doesn't influence my ranking, but I kind of want to see other people's insights, because maybe I missed something. But Show No Mercy is an excellent first release for this band. Slayer dominated in the 80s. They were fucking awesome in the 80s. So just because I put 2 of their 80s albums lower on the list, again, stick around. Show No Mercy has one of my all-time favorite Slayer tracks on it, Cryonics. I love, since I was 14, my friend Damon happened to burn that song on the CD, so I've loved the song Cryonics for at least half my life. I love the punk sound. I love that it sounds like something you'd hear like on a Tony Hawk Pro Skater game. The dual guitar solo, like, it's just an excellent song with the time changes and everything. But other than that, songs like Metal Storm and Face the Slayer, that's a 2-part song title, is a very well-written vintage 80s song. For an album that came out in 1983, when the 80s thrash metal scene was really kicking off, I believe it came out the same year as Kill 'Em All from Metallica. Slayer was definitely ahead of their time, and they were definitely one of the pioneers of this. This is kind of like their least evil sounding album, believe it or not, because they play it in regular E standard tuning. They're not tuned a half step down to E flat standard or drop C or drop B like their other albums. So this is actually kind of one of their more happy sounding albums, if you can believe it. So not to say that takes away from the charm, but the intensity of the album doesn't match up to what some of their future releases would do. I'm going to turn my car off. But Evil Has No Boundaries, Antichrist are solid album openers. Fight Till Death, but just like, again, solid album. No songs really dip below an 8.2 or an 8.1. But because there's only 2 really great tracks on here, to elevate it higher, again, Metal Storm and Cryonics, that's why, just like the other ones, it kind of sits comfortably like in the middle of the list at number 7. So some of these lower ranked ones I only have so much sentimental or nostalgia for, but just like a lot of other ranked and reviews I've done, I can easily acknowledge that the band hit the ground running with their first release. So Show No Mercy definitely showed no mercy. Anyway, number 6 spot, which kind of ends this first 3-way tie, but I'm giving the edge to this album. At number 6, we have their 2006 release, album number 9, Christ Illusion, opens up with one of Slayer's best opening tracks, Flesh Storm. The intensity of that. They play in drop B in this album, so it just sounds like just evil. There's kind of a more round tone to this album compared to like World Painted Blood, which was a little bit crunchier. But Christ Illusion is definitely one of their most evil sounding albums. They slow down in the right spots, they speed up in the right spots, and they inject just enough hooks to where songs like Skeleton Christ and Eyes of the Insane definitely elevate this album higher, just marginally higher, over albums like World Painted Blood or Show No Mercy. Back in the day when I became privy to Slayer, Christ Illusion was the album that had just come out. So I had the song Cult on my iPod, my little iPod Nano. It was like the first generation, easily scratched because it was black. It was the white ones didn't scratch as easy. Anyway, so I've been a little privy to Christ Illusion, mostly the song Cult, but revisiting it, the album definitely did age well. It's consistent for the most part. The only songs where, in my opinion, it kind of dips are songs like Jihad and Black Serenade, but those are still great tracks though. So Christ Illusion's got a little bit of nostalgia value for me, and again, songs like Flesh Storm, Skeleton Christ, Eyes of the Insane, Cult, all those songs and their catchiness definitely elevate this album higher up. Eyes of the Insane, again, what Slayer does best since the 80s is slow down at the right spots, but then like dynamically make it to where the speed or the intensity or the roar of Tom Araya's voice. Tom Araya sounds, I haven't talked about his vocals too much, or even the music, which I'm going to talk about in some of these. This is my first take here. But the drop B sounds of Christ Illusion are just low end. They're evil. The chorus of Skeleton Christ with that fast, you know you never seen the second coming. I take the devil any day. Hail Satan. I'm not condoning that. I'm just saying it's just kind of the hook. The most fucked up hook in Christ Illusion and Skeleton Christ is just fucking catchy and heavy at the same time. And catchy and heavy is a beautiful combination that Slayer executes pretty well, to say the least. So that's what brings Christ Illusion higher up. And then Eyes of the Insane, just those nasty diminished chords. So both Skeleton Christ and Eyes of the Insane have disgusting choruses with complementary guitar work and Tom Araya just throwing in hooks. And then, of course, again, Flesh Storm just opens up with a lot of intensity. So yeah, that's the number 6 spot, Christ Illusion. All right, can I do the top 5 and one more clip? All right, top 5. The next 3 are a 3-way tie, again, but I figured out how to rank these things accordingly. So at the number 5 spot, we actually have their most recent release, and probably their last, Repentless. If this is their last album, they went off on a high, and that seems to be the general consensus of the metal community and the Slayer community. I've noticed that Repentless is generally beloved, and 2016 was an excellent year for thrash metal because all big 4 bands put out monster albums. Hardwired to Self-Destruct from Metallica, Dystopia from Megadeth, and then, damn it. I'm sorry, I'm doing such a disservice to Anthrax in this video. Kings and something, Gods and Kings, or whatever it's called. And anyway, Anthrax's 2016 release. All the big 4 put out solid albums that year. Repentless was no exception. Delusions of Savior is an awesome intro, which is, I believe, the only Slayer album that technically has an intro. It kicks off with one of their most high-octane title tracks, Repentless, which has a pretty brutal music video. But just the thrash here, I think Repentless might be a perfect marriage between albums like Christ Illusion and World Painted Blood. It's got the intensity and the speed of World Painted Blood, but it's got some of the more of the hooks and some of the low-end drop B nasty sludge that you would hear in like Christ Illusion. So the drop B material, which is dominant on Repentless, really shines throughout. It's a very consistent album. My favorite tracks off this album are, of course, the title track, Cast the First Stone, and then of course You Against You. You Against You is one of my top 10 Slayer tracks. I love that song. But yeah, it's a very easy album to listen to from front to back, Repentless. And again, Slayer is leaving on a high note. If this is their last album, they did phenomenal, and the music writing is excellent here. This is the album that has, I believe, the lead guitarist of Exodus here complimenting Kerry King. So the guitar work is excellent. Tom Arroyo sounds awesome, even this far into his career. And it's just, it's one of their best sounding albums in terms of tone. So, excellent way to end an otherwise an incredible discography. Number 4. This is probably going to be the one that surprises people, unless you know who I am. Number 4, we have their 2001 release. I believe the album that came out on 9/11, God Hates Us All. This album to me is more of a new metal album than Diabolus Musica was. But it's still a Slayer album. It's still a thrash metal album. But just the guitar effects that are used with like the delay or the phasers or some of like the record scratching sounding effects that you can do on guitar just by pick scraping and like running your fingers across a muted string, that's more dominant on this album. But the speed, the intensity, the anger is very well communicated in this album. Of course, a big track that everybody loves, Disciple. Everybody loves Bloodline. And then my personal favorite track, the closing track, Payback. A couple of my top 10 Slayer tracks are on this album. So we got a lot of highly rated songs here. And then, you know, we have a couple of really thrashy, intense, fast tracks like Warzone or, is it New Faith or Exile? That's where a lot of the speed is. But God Hates Us All got a solid 8.41 out of 10. The new metal turn of the century sound is more prominent here, but again, they're flirting with it. They're on the edges of it. A Slayer fan would probably try to kick my ass for using the word flirt so much, but that's what they're doing. God Hates Us All is an intensely good album. It's very underrated in my opinion. And I don't think I've seen anybody else rank this album this high. So this is a preference thing. I do firmly believe that God Hates Us All is one of their best albums. And songs like Disciple, Bloodline, and Payback make that very, very doable. Other than that, solid album. New Faith, Threshold, Exile, Warzone, Seven Faces. A lot of great tracks on this album. Here Comes the Pain. Ugh! Anyway, turn of the century was a great time for music in my opinion, and Slayer was no exception. And then the last of this current three-way tie, we go to 1988, South of Heaven. South of Heaven gets the slight edge over God Hates Us All because it's just a very solid album. I mean, so is God Hates Us All, but just the consistency and just the potency of what Slayer did with a follow-up effort. So to follow up, let me put it this way. They had an easier time following up Diabolus Musica with God Hates Us All. It's a much bigger challenge to follow up Rain and Blood. So South of Heaven definitely accomplished that by doing that. They took the intensity and the speed of Rain and Blood and they slowed it the fuck down, and they kind of showed that they could be heavy and slow at the same time, but they didn't completely abandon speed on this album. One of their absolute best tracks, Ghost of War, in my opinion, is a monster of a thrash and a fast track overall. That's not the only fast song on the album. You know, Silent Scream, Live Undead. But my other personal favorites on this album are Behind the Crooked Cross, and then of course the title track, the opening track, South of Heaven. South of Heaven, I actually used to have a t-shirt of this. I don't know how I got away with wearing it when I was a freshman in high school, but I got it at Hot Topic. I really love this album. It's very easy to listen to from start to finish. It's got a certain charm to it, and they definitely changed it up a bit, but I can see how, even though Rain and Blood was of meteoric success, South of Heaven still managed to carry the mantle and carry the torch of different types of thrash metal. So they essentially closed off the decade by proving that they could maintain their intensity, but also slightly deviate from it with different time changes, and they did it really well, to say the least, with South of Heaven easily in their top 3. And now we get to their 2 best albums, which I love doing these types of videos because people see like my lower rankings or my middle rankings, but then where we find solidarity in the metal community is you're often going to find that for some of these bands that are so iconic, we're generally going to agree what their best albums are. You know, we might disagree or agree on middle and bottom albums, but I find that with a lot of my top picks for some of these bands, we're going to find agreement here. So just for anybody punching their screen right now saying, what the fuck, this guy's not a Slayer fan, shut the fuck up and listen. At the number 2 spot, we have their 1990 release, album number 5. Fucking 5 albums in like 7 years. Like, Slayer worked their fucking asses off. Seasons in the Abyss. Yeah, the early 90s. The early 90s were a great time for the Big Four. And by the early 90s, I mean the change of the decade. And then maybe like up to 1993 or 4, depending on what band we're talking about. Seasons of the Abyss was no exception. Came out the same year as Megadeth's Rust in Peace, and it came out a year before the Black Album from Metallica. I don't remember what Anthrax did, unfortunately. Seasons in the Abyss definitely opens up with one of Slayer's best opening tracks, War Ensemble. To me, that's the best song on the album. Seasons in the Abyss, again, I like doing this. I like saying that certain albums are like a certain combination of other albums. Seasons in the Abyss, of course, sounds like a marriage between Rain and Blood and South of Heaven, because they took the speed and the intensity of Rain and Blood and then they married it to some of the more slow, more evil, melodic parts of South of Heaven, and they created Seasons in the Abyss. Seasons in the Abyss is usually either most Slayer fans' favorite or second favorite, so here we are. War Ensemble really kicks it off hard, but then it really continues on pretty consistently with Blood Red, Spirit, and Black, Expendable Youth, but then for me, the album picks up and gets better with the other best tracks on the album, Dead Skin Mask and Hollowed Point. I love those tracks. Skeletons of Society is also pretty catchy. Like, I do like that there's hooks in thrash metal with these albums. Like, the chanting, the talking, like, Tom Arroyo just sounds great on this album. And then it closes. don't have a whole lot to say about Temptation or Born of Fire, except Born of Fire sounds like a light version of War Ensemble, just like the intense speed and everything. Seasons in the Abyss is an excellent closer. It's kind of like the opposite effect of what they did with South of Heaven. They didn't open up with the slow track. They closed with the slow track. And there's just a haunting, catchy tone to that chorus that's very reminiscent to something that you hear as South of Heaven, but you inject a little bit of that Seasons in the Abyss style intensity there, and you find that the era between basically the perfect trifecta of Slayer albums are Rain and Blood, South of Heaven, and Seasons in the Abyss. That was kind of like their crown jewel era that I believe most people would agree with. So yeah, Seasons in the Abyss gets a perfect 8.5 out of 10, which means that it's, at least to me, a great album. I would say a lot of these albums are excellent, but just going off of preference here, I'm just objectively saying that album gets an 8.5 out of 10 for me. But then we get to their best album, which is actually an excellent album. It's a fucking crown jewel of thrash metal. I'm not breaking ground here. Number 1 is fucking Rain and Blood. Fucking Slayer, man. Rain and Blood is their shortest album, clocking in at just 29 minutes. But it is 29 minutes of absolute hell. Like, the theme, the speed, the darkness, just the menacing overall, again, theme and overture, the lyrical themes, the sound that they accomplished in the studio. This is just a perfect snapshot here, where just like with, was it 1986 that Master of Puppets came out? There's just certain years during the 80s and early 90s where 2 bands put out their crown jewels, or maybe 3 bands put out their crown jewels. But 1986 was one of the best years in music, especially for metal music, because you had Master of Puppets from Metallica, but then you had fucking Rain and Blood, who put out an album that's probably like less than half the album length, but has just as much intensity. It's okay if other bands get melodic, or they slow down, or they have these long song structures, but Rain and Blood just doesn't fucking waste any time. A lot of the tracks are under 2 minutes long, and they just don't waste any time. They trim the fat. This is like the most enjoyable half hour of your GD life. It opens up with their best opening track, Angel of Death. That's an iconic Slayer song. If it's not Rain and Blood, most people say that Angel of Death is their best track. It continues, just like Seasons in the Abyss with the intensity, but they do it better. Piece by Piece and Necrophobic are even more intense somehow. Like, every song on here is enjoyable, but the best way to enjoy Rain and Blood is to listen to it from front to back. But at least 4 of my top 10 Slayer tracks are off this album. Angel of Death, of course. Criminally Insane, just that... the fucking drums that just lead to just intense guitar chugging and just intensity, disgusting guitar solos. Criminally Insane. Just the hook where Tom Arroyo finishes his line and then the fucking machine gun music just follows right behind it. Criminally Insane is an amazing track, definitely one of my favorites. And then you have the last 2 tracks. Obviously Reborn and Epidemic are awesome too, especially the way that Altar of Sacrifice blends perfectly into Jesus Saves. I don't know about you guys, but I can't tell where Altar of Sacrifice ends and Jesus Saves starts. That is a very seamless album. But the last 2 tracks, Postmortem, which is my favorite Slayer song. That fucking high scream he does. We're going to you die! I can't, I'm going to shred my vocal cords, but Postmortem is my favorite Slayer track of all time. And then, of course, Raining Blood, iconic thrash metal song, one of the most recognizable riffs of all time. If they had played that in E standard, it would have had nowhere near the same level of intensity that it has in E flat standard. So it sounds like I'm going to cut it short here because I don't want this clip to go too long. But Rain and Blood is easily their number 1 album. It's not even close. It gets at least a 9 out of 10. It's at least an excellent album. I don't know if I would call it a dime. I don't want to be generous with how many albums I give a perfect 10 out of 10. But Rain and Blood is definitely like either in my top 10 favorite albums or maybe in my top 15 favorite albums of all time. It's just perfect. There's no fat. It doesn't waste any time, but it still brings you enough intensity to where you feel like you didn't get shorted. So this is just a perfect in-your-face direct album, and it really captures the essence of what mid-80s thrash metal sounded like, and I wish I'd been alive to see it in its prime. But to close all this off, actually, you know what? I'm just going to do another clip. I mean, shit, I'm doing 11 albums here, so I'm trying to make these videos shorter, but what are you going to do? Yeah, so Rain and Blood is just a perfect Slayer album. Again, it doesn't waste any time. It's in your face and it's perfect and it's seamless. It's flawless. It's thrashy, but it's catchy. And Tom Arroyo's hooks, just the speed that he's like delivering some of the lines in songs like Reborn or Altar of Sacrifice, like just the amount of syllables he fits. He's like a Spitfire rapper, but in a thrash metal band in some of these songs. And yeah, once again, Postmortem, just the fucking howl he does. It just really, the first time I heard that, I like shat my pants. I was like, I could listen to this a bunch of times. The bookend effect of Rain and Blood. It opens with one of their best tracks of all time, and it closes with their most iconic track. It's just, it's a fucking perfect album. From start to finish, everything in between, no wasted time. Number 1 album. My breaking ground here, their best album is Rain and Blood, hands down, no competition. So to recap, and then I'll give you my top 10 Slayer songs. To recap, from 11 to 1, from the least best Slayer album to the absolute best Slayer album, we have Divine Intervention, Diabolus Musica, Hell Awaits, World Painted Blood, Show No Mercy, Christ Illusion, Repentless, God Hates Us All, South of Heaven, Seasons in the Abyss, and Rain and Blood. And then my top 10 Slayer songs, where maybe these top 5 might be a little fluid. They might rotate a little bit, but I know that the top 5, the bottom 5 are a little fluid, no particular order, but then the top 5 are probably my absolute top 5. We have You Against You from Repentless. We have 2 tracks from God Hates Us All, which are Disciple and Payback. We have War Ensemble from Seasons in the Abyss. Cryonics from Show No Mercy. Angel of Death. Ghosts of War from South of Heaven. And then, of course, my top 3 are all from Rain and Blood, also along with Angel of Death. Criminally Insane, Raining Blood, and Postmortem. Postmortem is probably my favorite Slayer song. Yeah, so that's my ranking. Thank you guys for watching or listening. Again, comment below what you agree or disagree with, what you would do differently, what Slayer albums or songs have certain meanings to you, what stories you may have. If you're going to talk about how you abused somebody at a Slayer concert, I'm not fucking interested in that. I don't like violence at concerts. I think it's okay to mosh and maybe get your ass kicked a little bit, but I'm part of a community that says if somebody gets knocked down in the pit, you pick them up. You don't fucking trample them. So I'm not interested in any stories of where you committed a crime or you hurt somebody. But if you want to tell me some other intense Slayer concert stories, I'm open to that too. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Why am I flailing here? Check out the rest of my ranked and reviewed videos. I do a podcast also where sometimes I kind of tease what some of my more in-depth thoughts are on certain albums or music are. And yeah, Happy New Year. Be prepared for me to do quite a bit more of these. I got quite a few more. I got at least 10 to 15 albums or bands on a list. So there will be more of these coming out. Thanks for watching. Fucking Slayer!